This morning we're going to talk about two such neighbourhoods, White Abbey and Black Abbey. I think from soundings I've done before this session and when we were doing research, a lot of people have heard of White Abbey as a district, but there are fewer people who've perhaps heard of Black Abbey. I'm going to firstly talk about White Abbey. Now, I'm going to firstly talk about the name. And these guys have got a lot to do with it. In fact, they've got everything to do. Not them particularly individually, but generally. Okay. So it's two matters that the name White Abbey refers to. So the first is the white. And the white refers to the Cistercian order of monks. So this is a Catholic religious order, and they wear white cowls or white robes. Okay. And the abbey bit refers to the land that the area we're talking about being originally owned by an abbey or a priory, and probably worked on what was called a grange or a farm. So granges were basically, you know, like you've heard of Lower Grange, and Haworth Road area used to be called Upper Grange. So a grange is, Horton Grange I suppose as well, yeah, is an area of land that would be owned by an abbey or a priory and was put to work either agriculturally or horticulturally. Quite a lot of areas around here were used for sheep farming because that was probably the most appropriate because the land wasn't flat, you know. But that's basically where the name comes from. There are all sorts of myths that have been flying around about places like White Abbey and Black Abbey, that there were abbeys on the land for both or something similar. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that that was the case. Even going back to the first talk I did late last year, which was about whether Bradford had ever had a castle, there have been myths flying around that, oh, Bradford once had a white castle and a black castle, and they were around there, or the Black Abbey area was to do with this legendary Black Castle of Bradford. There is not a shred of evidence that that's the case, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the connection was this, basically. This is where the name came from. And it's likely that it was Kirkstall Abbey that we're talking about. That was probably the closest Cistercian order to this place. There will have been other granges dotted around Yorkshire as well that will have been owned by the priory at Kirkstall. This was probably just one of many, and it'll probably been given to the priory sometime after the Normans settled in England. Because there was a lot of, obviously there was a lot of carving up of England into manors, but there was also a lot of gifting of land to the church and to monasteries as part of that process, which of course Henry VIII later on did, and decided to re-gift or sell off the land. Now, the Cistercian order is actually generally credited for bringing the wool industry to England. So, it's pretty well known that the monks at Kirkstall Abbey kept sheep, so they made money from the wool trade. So it's possible. It's not entirely 100% proved, but I would say it's more probable than not that the White Abbey area was used for sheep grazing, basically. So did anybody know that? No. Well, you do now.
How far back are you going for this?
I'm going to say, in a minute, not on the next slide, but on one further along. Right. So the area that we're talking about. Now, probably people will slightly disagree, but roughly, Lum Lane to the east, Carlisle Road to the north, then probably following Wetley Hill and White Abbey Road to the southwest until it meets Lum Lane. So sort of this wedge type shape. Some people might say, oh no, it doesn't include it there. Some people might say, oh, it goes a bit further there. Problem is this area was a different area known as Bellevue. Yeah. But as to where it began and ended, well, that is a matter of conjecture. Most of it was within the boundaries of the old Manningham township, Some of it towards the southeast part was part of the old Bradford township. Once Bradford and Manningham merged together in the 1840s, I think it was, when the borough of Bradford was created, it didn't really matter anyway where it had been previously. And probably things like the development of White Abbey as a neighbourhood were arguments justifying the merger with neighbouring areas, because you had geographical communities which straddled across these sort of municipal boundaries, which we still do today. I mean, Oakenshaw, for instance, half of the village is in Bradford and the other half is in Kirklees. It's ridiculous, really. This point is very, very important. Like pretty much all the other districts that I'm talking about in this series of talks, it was never an official district. So it was an area that had inherited a name that carried on being used during the time that Bradford expanded in the Industrial Revolution, but it never had official boundaries. You know, it wasn't like an area with, say, a parish council, or there wasn't a White Abbey ward, you know, with ward councillors or anything like that. So people will forever agree and disagree over where it begins and where it ends. But roughly, it was in that area. And look, even Google Maps has got it on.
It does, yeah.
Right. Okay. Moving on. So the origins of the area are unclear, but Kirkstall Abbey was built in 1152, and it handed the keys over to Henry VIII in 1539. So somewhere between those two dates, the White Abbey Grange was founded. Okay, but finding a map that goes back that far is quite a task, really. You know, the very lucky to find sort of 17th century maps I've found of Bradford that have enough detail on them to identify these places. So all I can say is it was sometime during that sort of nearly 200-year period that the Grange will have been founded. Now, it looks as though what we now call White Abbey Road today, which is the main road that then from Westgate that then flows into Wheatley Hill, was originally referred to as White Abbey. So the road was probably added later on. And that's, there are other examples of places like that in Bradford, such as New Leeds at the other end of Bradford, where it looks as though eventually New Leeds Road became the name, and then eventually just Leeds Road became the name for the area. There was a survey of the area done in 1811 by a gentleman called Mr. George Leather, and he described there being little colonies of dwellings in the area. He didn't really go into much detail about who lived in the area, what they did, but it was basically a linear settlement where you had properties that had been erected along the side of the road rather than going off the road. Same with Black Abbey on the other side, but we'll get to that in a bit. And this map, which is 1836, shows the name to be in use then, and there are very few buildings in the area. So pretty much once you got sort of to the bottom of what is now Lum Lane, Bradford sort of ceased really and became more open countryside there around that time. Now, from around the 1830s, this area began to change. Like so many parts of Bradford, it began to urbanise. So the Industrial Revolution had come to Bradford by that point. Bradford was expanding. Bradford was basically exploding. It was expanding that rapidly into its adjacent areas. So it had ceased to be this small market town, and it was becoming this urban industrial centre. And White Abbey was one of those areas which very quickly started to get built on. And like all the other neighbourhoods that we've talked about so far in the previous talks, it was essentially very densely packed. Streets and streets of back-to-back terraced houses that were to provide accommodation for workforce. It had one of the largest concentrations of woolcombers in Bradford. So it was very similar to a lot of these neighbourhoods, and that's one of the things I've found as I've read about the different areas. Apart from the name and apart from where they were in and around Bradford, there was such similar issues, particularly social issues, because of the poor housing stock, the poor streets, the lack of sanitation and clean water, the overcrowding, and the pollution. You know. So, like the other neighbourhoods, conditions soon became unbearable. Bradford Woolcomber's report of 1845, which is a really good sort of comprehensive look at all the different neighbourhoods that were in Bradford at the time, it surveyed it, commented there were no conveniences in White Abbey or facilities to dispose of household rubbish, and it was described as an ill-paved, extremely filthy neighbourhood. And of course that could have applied to many of the other places, for instance Longlands that we talked about, that was just across White Abbey Road. We know it suffered badly during the cholera epidemics in Bradford, which were basically from the 1830s to the 1850s. And like places like Longlands nearby, it had a very high Irish Catholic population. It was the second highest in terms of percentage of residents to Longlands. In fact, one of the things we found when we talked to people, even people who'd been residents in the 20th century who lived in Longlands, a lot of them said they lived in White Abbey. Which is not surprising really, because there were things like the St Pat's Church and the school, which will have been also used by residents who lived across the way, and also there will have been extended families. You know, there have been a lot of people who just became friends because they were originally from Ireland and because of their religion. So the lines were a bit blurred. But Longlands, which was the second talk I did last year, that was by far the highest proportion of Irish Catholic people that lived in Bradford. I would say White Abbey was the second when you look at the statistics. And one of the interesting things, interesting if you're interested in that sort of thing, the area had what were called many whist shops. Now, these were basically illegal pubs. So you'd get somebody who'd decide to open a pub in a house and sell beer, and it would usually also end up being somewhere that criminals met to buy stolen goods or to organise robberies, to do a bit of illegal gambling. Perhaps people who were involved in the sex trade might decide to hang around there to pick up a few clients, that sort of thing. Bradford arguably had fewer pubs per head than other major towns and cities in Britain at the time. The magistrates' bench in Bradford were pretty anti-pub really, and they were the ones who gave out the licences, and they decided that there was only going to be a set number of licences for Bradford, and so if you wanted to apply for a pub licence, you had to wait until another pub lost its licence or another pub burnt down or wherever for that licence to then become available. Also, the licences were renewed fairly frequently. I don't know if it was annually, but it was fairly frequently. They were a bit hypocritical really with the magistrates, because quite often they would entertain the idea of having the annual licensing meeting in one of the pubs. So it all depended upon who put on the best show for them as to, good show, you'll get your license again for the next period. And it was really, really hard for anybody who wanted to open a pub establishment to do so. So, given that it was probably safer to drink beer than it was to drink the local water, and just basically people did want to have alcohol, you got a lot of illegal pubs. That changed in 1830 when an Act of Parliament was passed that introduced beer houses. And beer houses were different. You couldn't sell wine, you couldn't sell spirits, but you could sell beer and ale. And you didn't get your licence from the local magistrates, you bought a certificate from the Exchequer instead. And unless you were someone who had a really serious criminal background, you'd get it, basically. So suddenly you had people who were turning their front rooms into beer houses, things like that. And a lot of the whist shops decided to suddenly become legal. And because at least then they wouldn't get raided by the police and shut down and that sort of thing. But White Abbey was pretty notorious for that. And by the latter part of the 19th century, it had a real reputation at White Abbey for drunkenness, disorderly conduct, and there was a local phrase coined, like White Abbey, which was basically to describe how bad the place was. So if you were talking about somewhere else and you said, oh, that, you know, I don't know, Broomfields, oh, that's like White Abbey, you would basically say, no, it's pretty bad. So people really knew about White Abbey for all the wrong reasons, really. Now, 1843, and Bradford gets a general hospital. Bradford Infirmary is opened on the junction of Westgate and Lum Lane. We now call this Infirmary Field. The hospital wasn't a municipal hospital, it wasn't a state venture, it was owned by a charitable trust. And it had been operating in Bradford since 1825. It had opened a dispensary on Darley Street, and then a year later it added a 4-bed ward to the site. But it saw that there was a need for something bigger than that. And it operated until 1936, when the Bradford Royal Infirmary was opened in Heaton. Should we say it's Heaton? Any other options? It's not Manningham anyway. Burlington?
On the borders.
On the borders. Right. No man's land. Neutral territory. Okay. Right. So by 1939 the hospital was demolished, the original hospital. My understanding is the land was originally owned by somebody who owned the, now get this right, was it Ironworks that were at Biley? It was a businessman who also owned that particular patch of land and sold it to this trust. Now, this is something which has been said to me a number of times, that people think there are archives of records still buried beneath the ground where there's records of patients. Now, I don't know whether this is true or whether this is an urban myth. Does anybody know anything more about it?
No, I've just heard that that's what happened when the old hospital, they couldn't move anything, they had to just bury everything underneath.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
How much of a truth that is, I don't know, but that springs back a long time ago, yeah.
Right, okay, right. Well, it's there. Take it with a massive piece of salt.
I remember the phone books.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the other things that White Abbey is quite famous for is Green Lane Primary School. This was the first school in the country to serve free school meals. It was also the first school, allegedly, to serve hot school dinners. So, presumably the first meals that were served were cold. In 1907, it supposedly started serving hot school meals, and it used the heat from the swimming pool boilers to cook the food. This was really largely down to Margaret Macmillan, who was the chair of Bradford School Board, and also a chap that we spoke about in the Longlands talk, Frederick Jowett. So just to backtrack about who Frederick Jowett was for anyone who didn't come to that session. Fred Jowett was the first independent Labour Party councillor who was elected onto Bradford Corporation. He was the chair of the Health Committee, and he basically made it his mission to try and improve living standards for working people in Bradford. Frederick Jowett and Margaret Macmillan knew one another. They were very close political allies. They both basically wanted to do what they could do in order to improve conditions. And I suppose Margaret Macmillan's mission was more to do with children and education and that side of things, which of course it's all part of the same thing, really. Now, I'm not quite sure if this is a picture of White Abbey or not. So
It's too posh.
well, let's use it for illustrative purposes only. Right. So, there'd already been the battle in Longlands about clearing that area, and that had taken a very long time to conclude. But once it happened, effectively the council had a sort of template approach from then on about declaring an area insanitary, clearing it, probably building some new council houses elsewhere to put people in for the time being, and then building new housing in the area that they've cleared. And because of its terrible conditions and its reputation, White Abbey was one of the prime contenders for slum clearance after Longlands had happened. Now, First World War got in the way because Longlands had been pretty much rebuilt and people had moved back just before the outbreak of the First World War. But there were other places that were being looked at, and it was right there on sort of very high up in the list. Now, Deputy Town Clerk of Bradford Corporation decided to describe White Abbey as a festering sore eating into the lives of inhabitants. So he had some opinions about it, really. And I think that probably, the fact that he was allowed to say that in public was probably, you know, it wasn't a secret that people had very negative views about the area and felt something had to be done to improve it. So, 1922, Health Committee of Bradford Corporation produces a plan for slum clearance in the area and the building of new social housing, which was called the White Abbey Unhealthy Area. Well, it says what it does on the tin. And £100,000 was earmarked for this work. Now, you couldn't build a house probably these days for £100,000, but I think back then that was a lot of money. Although I don't know whether it was enough money. That's a different matter. So, following First World War, 1923, residents are moved out of the area, and they moved to new housing either across the road in Longlands, if there were vacancies, or the new Lower Grange estate at Ollerton instead. So one of the impetuses behind building Lower Grange was to rehome people who lived at White Abbey. Now, there wasn't just houses, there were shops, pubs and other business premises that were demolished. But then when the housing was ready for people to return to in the 30s, there were some new facilities that were built. So for instance, the Melbourne Hotel, do people remember that? That was actually built by Bradford Corporation in 1935. It's interesting actually how there were quite a few pubs that were built by the council in Bradford. Sorry, were you about to say something? You looked as though you were on the verge of saying something.
I'm just thinking, sorry.
Not all of the housing in the area was initially demolished, from what I understand. Further back-to-backs were demolished in the 50s, and residents were given housing at Delph Hill in Wyke. As part of what we did, we interviewed some former residents of White Abbey. Now, this is, obviously this doesn't go back to the 19th century. They'd be very, very old if that was the case. But, they lived in the area in the 50s and 60s. It's a bit of a typo there. So in this the post-war period, White Abbey continued to have a very strong identity as an area, and it had quite a vibrant high street. And from what we understand, it was mostly White Abbey Road and perhaps Slum Lane were sort of the areas where things were going on. You know, where shops were. So this included a jeweller's, tailor's, a Swiss confectioner's, baker, pawnbroker, a butcher, draper, not a candlestick maker. I was told about a chiropractor who also sold a drink that's sort of tasted like terps. I don't know how anybody would know what terps tastes like. And the idea was that it relieved your backache. It was probably destroying your nerves or something.
I remember a shop on there that had all the jars right around the walls.
Right.
And they used to sell sarsaparilla.
Right. Okay.
It was the Dolls Hospital as well, wasn't it?
I interviewed someone who... Sorry. Yes, actually. Dolls Hospital. Yes. Oh gosh, no, that wasn't that a bit further up.
It was Friday.
Yeah. There's a fish and chip shop, and there were pubs in the area as well, which have changed names many times, amongst other things. Now, but the area apparently continued to have a bit of a poor reputation for crime. And from the residents that we interviewed, a lot of them would not let their children out to play because of this, and there were also sex workers working in the area. One particular was called Black Maria, who apparently was very active on Friday nights. What I picked up when I was interviewing these people, one of them, their family owned the fish and chip shop, was that I think it depended on who you were as to whether you were very happy to work to live out. And some of the people who ran the businesses, I think, perhaps kept themselves a bit isolated from the rest of people, and didn't necessarily mix and become a part of the community. That's what I picked up. So there also used to be men who would bet on dogs and rats fighting on Infirmary Field. But occasionally the police would turn up and break it up and arrest people. And there were several businesses in the area that were prosecuted for black market activities as well during those couple of decades that we found out. I think there was perhaps still a bit of the same sort of reputation and perhaps some activities going on in the area that go way back to before the area was cleared and rebuilt. From what I picked up anyway, it still had a bit of a bad reputation, did the area. By the latter part of the 20th century, there'd been population changes in many parts of Bradford, and White Abbey was part of that as well. And I think very much the businesses that started to spring up in the area were reflective of that, because obviously if population changes, you need businesses which will serve the interests and the demands of that new population. And one of the indirect consequences of that is that a lot of people, particularly a lot of people who've moved into the area since the Second World War, have really regarded White Abbey as part of Manningham rather than as part of a separate neighbourhood. And if White Abbey has been flagged up, it's always, oh, White Abbey, it's a district of Manningham, isn't it? You know, rather than White Abbey is a separate place. I found that quite a lot when I worked at Bradford College, along with students starting to use the postcodes as their neighbourhoods. You know, where do you live? Oh, sir, I live in BD8. You know. Where do you live? I live in BD5. Right, yeah. Not, I live in Manningham, I live in Girlington, I live in Little Horton, I live in West Bowling, wherever, you know. So it's quite inevitable if you do get population changes to residents that the way that they view their neighbourhood will change, and unless the historic identity of an area is very well pronounced, it tends to go. In an urban area, and especially in a very densely built urban area, it is harder, obviously, to see the boundaries between places. And over time, with population changes, it's much easier for people to simplify those boundaries, to start to feel that they're part of an adjacent district, you know, like Manningham or a postcode or whatever. Anyway, one of the consequences of that is that the identity of the area has dwindled. So practically all the other areas that we've been looking at, the identity of the area has more or less gone. So before Christmas we talked about Longlands. If you said to somebody, where is Longlands, they'd say, where do you mean? If you said Chain Street, they might get to know, but we found that after the Second World War, again there was a change in the makeup of the population. It became less Irish Catholic and became more mixed, and one of the consequences of that was the identity of the area altered and people started calling it by different names. Similarly, Broomfields, that we talked about before Christmas, which is in the south side of Bradford. If you said to somebody today, where is Broomfields, they wouldn't know. It's Hall Lane, Prospect Street, sort of where the interchange is.
Like Mill Lane.
Yes, Mill Lane, yeah,
Yeah.
that was Broomfields, yes. But today, people wouldn't know where it was. So unless you lived through that period, you're less likely to know. White Abbey, on the other hand, is an area that, although a lot fewer people seem to know where it is, there are still an awful lot of people that seem to know where you mean it. So we found, although a lot of that is from older people that we interviewed that still live in the area or nearby or have lived in the area, I would argue that it is a place that most people would very quickly figure out where we're talking about. So in that score, it's probably, of the lost neighbourhoods, it's the least lost, I would say.
But it's still got a lot of housing, isn't it?
It does, yes. So, Black Abbey, a place that people haven't heard of. It's to do with these guys. Again, not individually, but collectively. So, Black Abbey refers to two matters. The black refers to the Benedictine order of monks, which are again another Catholic religious order. They wear black robes instead. It must be a lot easier to keep those clean than the white ones. Do you imagine how many? You'd have to have one a day, wouldn't you, at least? And the Abbey, like White Abbey, the Abbey refers to the land originally being owned by a priory or abbey and probably worked as a grange or farm. Now this time we're not talking about Kirkstall Abbey, we're talking about Pontefract Priory. Because it's felt that it was probably the closest Benedictine order. And again, Pontefract Priory will have had granges around Yorkshire. It would not have been just this one piece of land. It's less clear though with this area what type of farming was used. It could have been sheep farming. However, Longlands, which is sort of parallel to where Black Abbey is, but a bit closer to the city centre, we know that was originally used for crop growing, because the name Longlands, is to do with the way that the fields were ploughed. So it's a possibility that it might not have been cattle farming, it might have been actually growing food on that land, but we don't know. So, where is it? It's a bit of an odd shape, isn't it? So, again, it's questionable exactly where we're talking about. The history books basically say that a lot of what was Black Abbey was focused around this end, which I'd say is one of the boundaries, which was, it used to be called Brick Lane and now is City Road. But the area, we think, was Thornton Road to the south, from end of City Road, Wetley Lane to the northwest, Wetley Hill and White Abbey Road down to the northeast, and then down City Road until it meets Thornton Road. But again, people agree and disagree. I think really it was just generally an area, and that was the issue. It didn't have defined boundaries again.
How far back was that? Because I was born in that area and never heard it referred to as Black Abbey.
We'll
Yes,
talk
sorry,
about that in a minute, but yes. Okay. Again, most of Black Abbey was within the boundaries of the old Manningham township. Some towards this end was in the old Bradford township, but that didn't really matter once the two merged together in the 1840s. And like practically all of our other lost neighbourhoods, perhaps with the exception of somewhere like Little Germany or Rickleyville, which we're going to be talking about next week, it didn't really have any official boundaries. It wasn't an official district. It was an area that people named and talked about, but probably people would have had different opinions as to where it began and ended. So, back to the same map that I showed before, White Abbey over here in the 1830s, Black Abbey there. And again, the origins are unclear, but Pontefract Priory was built around 1090, and it handed its keys to Henry VIII's agents in 1540. So it was obviously some time between these dates that Black Abbey Grange was founded. Pontefract Priory, as far as I know, is pretty much doesn't exist anymore now. I think there might be a few tiny ruins on a bit of land now. It's not like Kirkstall, where a lot of it has been preserved. And again, same map as I showed you earlier, that's dated in 1836. It shows the name is in use at that time, but again, there's very few buildings. There's even fewer buildings on that side of the road. And again, most of them just follow White Abbey Road. So it's arguable that what there was linear to the road to begin with. Now, what we do know about the area, there's a book that I've referred to in one of my previous talks, a John James book, 1841, The History and Topography of Bradford. Now, he talks about a William Field in 1686 transferring 4 closes of land in this area to 2 gentlemen, Thomas Leyland and James Durham. And the purpose of this was that the profits from the rents of this land would be used to aid the poor in Bradford. So basically, it was a way of making money to then redistribute on things to aid the poor of Bradford. Now, William Field didn't have any heirs, so he wasn't going to be able to pass his land down to anybody else when he died. So he set up a charitable trust, and it was called the Black Abbey Dole, and sometimes it was referred to as Field's Charity. And dole is an old word that basically refers to a benefit paid to the needy, hence the expression of being on the dole. If you're if you're unemployed and you're signing on. Now, it appears that initially the land was used for agriculture, and then later it was used for quarrying. I'm not entirely clear as to what was quarried, whether it was just stone or whether it was coal or iron ore or what. I think it was probably just stone, because I'm sure there would be a lot more written up about it if it was something like coal or iron ore. But that was initially what happened. So the people that originally grew food and then later were extracting material will have paid fees to the Black Abbey Dole to do so, and that money will have then been used in some way on activities to benefit the poor. But by the 19th century, with what was happening in Bradford, with Bradford suddenly exploding and these new areas being built, the trustees decided to lease the land for building development. They decided that was far more of a lucrative option, and so they gave permission for others to build land on the charities, to build properties on the charities' land. So the idea would be, you would put a house or you would put a commercial building on the land, but you wouldn't own the land underneath it, so you would have to pay a land rent regularly. A bit like, I suppose, a leasehold, rather than freehold. There are quite a lot of places when you look around that still have something like that. When I lived in Sandy Lane, there was a whole row of houses they didn't own the land that the houses had been built on, so every year they had to pay a land rent. It seemed a bit medieval, really. So, by the 1840s, the area started to become urbanised in a similar way to White Abbey. Because why would it just stop across the road? And this is an old map that shows when it was still Brick Lane and land was being leased off, I think. But despite the area being owned by a charity, that didn't really make much difference in terms of what was actually put on the land. So the conditions for the housing stock that was being erected were just as bad as White Abbey, I would say. You had very cheap, quickly thrown up, densely packed back-to-back terraced houses, no real sanitation, no clean water, etc. And it was no different really. Bradford didn't have any building regulations back then. There was not really much in the way of being able to do anything about it. So again, as I said, Black Abbey became dominated by back-to-back terraced houses. And 1845, the Bradford Walcombes report actually refers to Black Abbey and describes it as a badly paved and ill-drained area. No drinkable water supplies except if you were to purchase water, and there were terribly unpleasant smells, which I don't think was cooking.
Was it a commercial avenue?
Yes. Yeah, it was. Pretty much all this end of Bradford was very Irish Catholic. So the main part of Black Abbey initially was around the Brick Lane area. By the 1890s, this was widened and it was renamed City Road. And I haven't found out exactly what year, I just know it was within that decade. Now, as a consequence of that, it looks as though some properties were cleared, as you know, because if you're going to make a road wider and there's stuff built right next to the road, then obviously you need to remove at least one row of houses on one side. And so it could be that not just improving the road, but removing some of the worst of the slum properties was part of the main object of the exercise. This happened with Silsbridge Lane before, which is now Grattan Road. And similarly, residents were not offered any new houses, so there will have been a lot of people who will have suddenly been thrown out and the houses that they were living in were torn down. Having said that, this doesn't make it any better, but it was quite common for people to have to move around anyway, because you didn't own your home, you paid rent, and quite often you pay a daily rent, you know, so you'd pay so much quite often to sleep on the floor that night, you and your family, and then it might be that the next day you had to go somewhere else, and so long as you could get to work, that seemed to be all that mattered. So there was no attempt to offer people housing anywhere else. Now, as a result of this, the area around City Road changed, so it ceased to be residential and it became more dominated by businesses. And it seems to be pretty much around this time, sort of the widening of City Road, that the name Black Abbey starts to fall out of use. So if that was the focal point for the neighbourhood, I suppose it's a bit like ripping the heart out of an area, and it just changes as a result. During the 20th century, a lot of new through terraced houses were built in the area, further up the Black Abbey area towards Wetley Lane and Wetley Hill. And what seemed to happen was, on the one hand, the name Black Abbey started to fall out of use, and a lot of people started to feel that the area was simply part of neighbouring Girlington or perhaps Manningham, but that it wasn't a separate locality, you know, that it was probably part of an adjacent neighbourhood instead. So from the interviews I've done, the name Black Abbey appears to have totally gone by the post-war period. So when I spoke to people who had been residents of White Abbey in the 50s and 60s, and I asked them what their memories were of Black Abbey, they'd say, where? It pretty much gone by that point, and the reference to it on maps seems to have disappeared by that point as well, which I guess basically reflects that social change, that it was no longer regarded as being a neighbourhood or as a district. So, has anybody got any questions or comments?